The day began like any other for Lena Davis. A sunny morning with no important meetings on the calendar and a rare moment of respite in the hectic routine of a CEO. Wearing a simple sweater and jeans, she decided to take care of something personal, a withdrawal of $5,000 at a Davis Financial branch. For any ordinary client, it was a straightforward transaction, without complications. But Lena wanted more than just money. She wanted to experience, without warnings or protocols, how her own clients were treated on a daily basis. Thus, without scheduling an appointment or alerting the team to her presence, she entered the branch like any other account holder. As soon as she passed through the glass doors, she felt the first signs of detachment. The environment was cold, with a slight smell of burnt coffee mixed with the woody cologne of the security guard at the entrance. At the service counter, the young teller, Sophie Matthews, with a delicate face and eyes always glued to the computer screen, didn't even look up to greet her. She merely slid a form toward Lena, without a word. That did not go unnoticed. Lena, accustomed to a world where her presence attracted immediate attention and respect, now experienced the invisibility of someone who did not appear important. Lena took the form and filled in the necessary information without haste. Her name, the withdrawal amount, her signature, simple. She slid the paper back to Sophie along with her identification. The teller finally looked up at her, but the reaction was instantaneous. A wrinkle formed between her thin eyebrows, and her mouth tightened into a tense line. She held onto the document longer than necessary, as if trying to find something suspicious. Then, without saying a word, she got up and walked into the restricted area of the branch, disappearing behind the frosted glass door. Lena sighed and crossed her arms. This no longer seemed like a routine procedure. With years of experience in the financial sector, she knew exactly how a withdrawal of this size should be handled. The identification was valid. The amount was within the permitted limit for withdrawals without an appointment. There was absolutely no reason for the delay. The clock on the wall marked 3 minutes since Sophie had disappeared, and Lena could already feel the eyes of some surrounding customers. A mix of curiosity and disinterest, typical of those who notice something strange but do not wish to get involved. 5 minutes passed when the glass door finally opened again, but instead of Sophie, out came a man in a light grey suit with a stern expression. Brad Sullivan, the branch manager, walked to the counter with a measured step, as if he were about to resolve a problem. He seemed like the type of person who loved to exert authority, tall, with neatly combed hair, always sporting a half-smile that never reached his eyes. He held Lena's document between his fingers, turning it slightly, as if examining a mysterious artifact. "Good afternoon, Ms. Davis?" He said the name as if he couldn't believe it was real. "I'm Brad Sullivan, the manager of this branch. I see here that you wish to withdraw $5,000. Correct?" Lena nodded, already feeling irritation rising in her chest. "Yes, I already handed over my ID and filled out the form. Everything is in order?" Brad let out a short laugh, almost a sigh. He looked at Sophie, who remained by the counter as if waiting for instructions. "We just need to run some security checks. Nothing more. You understand, right? We have to be cautious with transactions of this magnitude." His tone was gentle, yet laced with condescension. Lena maintained a firm gaze on him. "Of course, as long as these checks are the same as those done for any client who comes here to withdraw that amount." Brad hesitated for a brief moment before smiling again. "Just a few routine questions. What do you do for a living, Ms. Davis?" The question hit like a brick. It wasn't a standard procedure. And Lena knew exactly what was happening. Lena blinked slowly, feeling her blood warm. The question wasn't just inconvenient, it was a test. Brad didn't need to know her profession to release a withdrawal from her own account. He wasn't following a protocol. He was assessing whether she appeared to be a person who would have $5,000 available. "I'm an entrepreneur," she replied, keeping her voice controlled. Brad raised an eyebrow as if unconvinced. He turned the document in his hand, holding it up to the light, scrutinizing every detail as if expecting to find an error. Sophie remained by his side, restless, alternating glances between the two without the courage to intervene. "And what is your company?" Brad pressed, his tone bordering on disdain. Lena crossed her arms, measuring him. This game had gone too far. Davis Financial. The impact of the name was immediate. Sophie blinked quickly, her posture stiffening. Brad, on the other hand, maintained his composure, but something in his expression faltered for a fraction of a second before he recomposed his mask of a self-assured manager. "I see." He turned to Sophie. "Double-check the account, please." The teller nodded and began typing into the system, her hands visibly tenser than before. Lena observed everything with a mix of incredulity and frustration. What more was needed to release the money? It was clear that the suspicion did not stem from company policy, but from a silent and unsettling bias that she knew all too well. Brad faced her again. "Would you mind telling us what the amount of your last deposit was?" That was the last straw. Lena uncrossed her arms and rested her hands on the counter, leaning slightly forward. If Brad expected her to cave in, he was gravely mistaken. "My last deposit?" she repeated, her voice carrying an edge. "Are you asking me to prove that my account has money?" Brad maintained his false smile, but Lena could sense the discomfort growing behind those calculating eyes. "These are just security measures, Miss Davis. It's nothing personal." "Nothing personal?" She let out a short laugh. "Then why did the client who was here before me withdraw a similar amount and leave in less than 3 minutes? Without interrogation, without a manager, without extra security measures?" Sophie froze. Brad straightened his shoulders. "You need to understand that we work to prevent fraud." Lena raised a hand, cutting him off. "And you think I'm a fraud? Because that's exactly what's happening here." The atmosphere grew tense. Some customers pretended not to listen, while others openly watched the scene. Even the security guard at the entrance began to pay attention, as if expecting something to escalate. Brad cleared his throat. "We're not accusing anyone. We just need to confirm a few details." Lena held his gaze for several seconds before speaking, her voice calm yet cutting. "So here's some information for you, Brad. I've been a client of this branch for years. My name is in the system. My identification was validated. The balance is available. The only thing wrong here is the way you're treating me." For a moment, the manager didn't know what to say. But then, with an almost imperceptible movement, his hand slid below the counter. Lena immediately recognized the gesture. He had pressed the security button. Lena saw Brad's discreet movement and felt a surge of indignation. Were they calling security on her? Why? Because she was asking for her own money? Because she dared to question the absurdity of the situation? She took a deep breath, maintaining her composure. Panic was not an option. In fact, now she was certain that she needed to see this through to the end. "Did you just call security for me?" Her voice was firm, yet without raising the tone. Brad interlaced his fingers over the counter, feigning an air of professionalism. "Ms. Davis, this is part of our protocol when there are inconsistencies in a transaction." "Inconsistencies?" Lena tilted her head. "You mean inconsistencies like me wearing a sweater and not a blazer? Or inconsistencies like you not thinking that someone like me could have that money?" Sophie averted her eyes, biting her lip. She knew that this wasn't a protocol, and the blame was clearly written on her face. Before Brad could respond, the branch door opened, and a tall security guard with crossed arms approached. He surveyed the scene and looked at Brad, waiting for instructions. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his deep voice laden with authority. Brad turned to him, assuming a tone of superiority. "Just a standard procedure, Tony. This lady is trying to withdraw a considerable amount, and we are performing some verifications." Lena let out a short, ironic laugh. "Incredible. Now a withdrawal has turned into a security case. You know what's funnier? I am the founder of this bank." The silence that followed was almost deafening. The impact of Lena's words struck like lightning. Sophie's eyes widened, her face losing color. The security guard, Tony, frowned in confusion, but it was Brad who suffered the greatest blow. His rehearsed smile vanished instantly, and he blinked several times, as if trying to process what he had just heard. "What?" He uttered the word, unable to hide his shock. Lena rested one hand on the counter and, with the other, tapped lightly on the name on her document as if teaching something basic to a child. Lena Davis, founder and CEO of Davis Financial, the bank where you work. Brad opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. Nervousness began to show. He glanced briefly at Sophie, then at Tony, seeking some form of support, but no one moved. "And now I want you to tell me, Brad," Lena continued, her voice firm and unwavering, "if I were a man in a suit, would you have asked these same questions? If I were a client who looked rich enough to be here, would you have called security?" Brad tried to stammer something, but Lena didn't give him room. "You treated me like a suspect in my own bank, while other clients passed through this counter without any problem. Do you think that's acceptable?" The air grew heavy. Tony let out a discreet sigh, as if he already understood the gravity of the situation. Sophie, pale, stared at the floor. Brad swallowed hard. "Ms. Davis, he began, but Lena raised her hand, interrupting him. "There's no point in explaining now. You've already made it clear who you really are." The ensuing silence seemed to drag on for hours. Brad looked at Lena as if he were facing an already passed sentence. He opened his mouth again, then closed it without saying a word, perhaps because he knew that any excuse would sound pathetic at that moment. Lena looked around and noticed that the other branch customers were now attentive. Some were whispering, others simply watching, but everyone knew they were witnessing something significant. "So tell me, Brad," Lena continued, her voice firm and controlled, "what happens now? Do you still need to verify if I have enough money in my account? Or are you going to call someone else to deal with me?" Brad nervously ran a hand through his hair, his confidence visibly crumbling. Sophie still dared not lift her head. Tony, the security guard, appeared uncomfortable, but made no move to intervene. I think there's been a misunderstanding," Brad finally managed to say, his voice now laden with hesitation. Lena crossed her arms and raised an eyebrow. "Misunderstanding? Because to me, it seems that I was treated differently for a very specific reason. And if this happened to me, I can only imagine what happens to clients who do not have the power to react." Brad opened his mouth to respond, but Lena was already taking her phone out of her pocket. She swiped her finger quickly across the screen and raised the device. "You know what? Let's make sure this doesn't happen again. I think a live broadcast will be useful to show how my own bank treats clients unequally." The threat hung in the air like a hammer about to fall. Brad paled. Instinctively, Brad raised his hands as if he could physically prevent Lena from pressing the record button. His face, once full of false confidence, now displayed pure panic. "Ms. Davis, there's no need to take this to that level." "Oh, but there is," Lena interrupted, her voice sharp, "because without this, tomorrow you'll treat someone else the same way." Tony, the security guard, crossed his arms and shook his head, seeming to understand that this wouldn't end well for Brad. Sophie, still motionless behind the counter, finally lifted her eyes and looked at Lena, her expression a mixture of shame and concern. "Ms. Davis, please," Sophie intervened, her voice almost a whisper. I didn't mean to cause any trouble." Lena looked directly at her, and for a moment there was a silent wait between them. She wasn't the main problem there, but she had been complicit by not questioning what was happening. "I hope you learned something from this, Sophie," Lena said, not with anger, but without softening the impact, because staying silent while witnessing something wrong is just as bad as participating. Sophie lowered her head again. Brad, on the other hand, continued struggling to maintain his posture. "Miss Davis, I can process your request immediately. I can guarantee that this will never happen again." Lena let out a dry laugh. "Oh, You can guarantee that after calling security on me, after treating me like a criminal in the bank I founded? Brad was speechless. He knew he had no way out. Lena looked around one last time, took a deep breath and finally said, "Here's what's going to happen now. You're going to call the regional director. Now." Brad hesitated for a moment, but realized he had no alternative. With trembling hands, he picked up the phone from the counter and dialed. While waiting for the call to be answered, he looked at Lena as if searching for some form of redemption. But Lena offered no relief. "Yes, this is Brad Sullivan, manager of the Central Branch. I need to speak with the regional director, immediately." His voice was lower, less firm. He exchanged a few curt words with the person on the other end of the line and then nodded. "He's on his way." Lena stepped back, crossed her arms, and waited. The atmosphere in the branch remained charged. Customers glanced sideways. Employees tried to appear busy, but it was obvious that everyone was paying attention to the unfolding situation. Less than 10 minutes later, a man in a dark suit entered through the glass door of the branch. Jonathan Hayes, the regional director, had an imposing presence, with neatly combed grey hair and a sharp gaze that swept the room as soon as he entered. His eyes met Lena's and immediately transformed into something close to despair. "Miss Davis!" He hurried toward her, completely ignoring Brad, who was trying to appear calm by the counter. "What's going on here?" Lena tilted her head slightly, her gaze fixed on the director. "What's happening, Jonathan, is that your manager denied me access to my own account. He asked unnecessary questions, treated me with suspicion, and when he couldn't justify his discrimination, he called security in the bank that I founded." Jonathan paled. He spun on his heel to face Brad, who already seemed smaller than when it all began. "You'd better tell me this didn't happen," the director said, his voice low and tense. Brad opened his mouth to respond, but Lena was quicker. "The entire branch saw it, Jonathan. There is no excuse. The only question now is, what are you going to do about it?" Jonathan closed his eyes for a brief moment, as if gathering the patience to deal with the disaster before him. When he looked back at Brad, his gaze was pure ice. "You're fired." The sentence was delivered directly, without hesitation. Brad paled even more, his mouth opening and closing as if trying to argue. But no words came out. Sophie covered her mouth with her hand, shocked. "Mr. Hayes, Brad tried to justify himself, but Jonathan raised his hand in a sharp gesture. "I don't want to hear a word. Not only did you fail to follow the basic principles of our institution, but you also exposed the bank to ridicule. If you think I can allow you to remain in your position after this, then you have gravely underestimated my intelligence." The ensuing silence was heavy. Brad finally lowered his head and nodded, knowing he had no escape. Jonathan then turned to Sophie. "And you?" His voice still carried harshness. Sophie trembled slightly, but found the courage to speak. I followed the manager's instructions. I didn't know what to do." Lena observed the scene and realized that Sophie was not as culpable as Brad, but her omission made her complicit. "You won't be fired, Sophie," Lena said, her voice firm but without cruelty. "But you will undergo intensive training, you and all the employees of this branch." Jonathan nodded quickly. "Agreed. Starting today, the company will implement a mandatory training program against discrimination and implicit bias. I want a report on this on my desk by the end of the week." He then looked at Lena, his posture more restrained. "Ms. Davis, I deeply regret what happened here today. I can assure you that strict measures will be taken so that this never happens again." Lena took a deep breath and crossed her arms. "I don't want empty guarantees, Jonathan. I want real change." In the following days, the repercussions of the incident spread throughout Davis Financial. The executive team convened an emergency meeting, and Lena made sure to be at the center of the decisions. The anti-discrimination training was expanded to all branches, with a mandatory program that required not only participation, but also rigorous evaluation. In addition, a new internal audit system was implemented to ensure that clients were treated equitably, regardless of appearance, attire, or any other irrelevant factor. But for Lena, the greatest change was not the policy, it was the awareness. As she walked through the corridors of the bank's headquarters, she reflected on what that experience truly meant. It wasn't just about Brad or Sophie, nor even about that single incident. It was about a silent system that allowed this kind of behavior to repeat itself in different places, with different people, every day. She thought of the clients who did not have the power to contest such treatment. People who were discredited, humiliated, and who simply left, swallowing their indignation because they had no other choice. Lena knew that her position gave her a privilege, the ability to change the rules of the game. She didn't want Davis Financial to be just another bank. She wanted it to be a symbol of something greater, of justice, dignity, and respect. And she knew that this commitment would have to be renewed every day, in every branch, in every service. With that thought, she entered the meeting room and closed the door behind her. Change was beginning now.